Good morning. Can you hear me okay? It's good to be back here at Holy Communion. Thanks for showing up on the holiest of Sundays in America. And of course, I mean the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, which leads into Lent. I'd be happy to talk to you about the Super Bowl, but unfortunately I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan, so I know absolutely nothing about the Super Bowl. Sad. I just found out Ben is a Denver Broncos fan, and the Broncos were the source of much pain for the Browns many years ago. But we're here in a place where pain can be accepted, right, and healed, and so it's good to be here. Where should I start? I should start by introducing two of the three women who are most responsible for my career in journalism. And so if you have any problems with what I write, see them. Laura Coleman was my mentor back in the day when I started writing for the Commercial Appeal. She was a longtime journalist, current Episcopalian, so congratulations. And then my mother, Nancy Waters, who just give you a little, she just moved in the neighborhood last year, so I'll give you a little tip. She's kind of between churches. She grew up in she didn't grow up in she spent a lot of time as an adult in the Methodist church, and then she spent some time in the Catholic church. I've been trying to get her to split the difference and visit the Episcopal church. So here she is. Now, when we walked in, I introduced the man to my mother, and he noted how young she looked, and we both said thank you. She's always looked very young to me. Of course, she was 18 when she got married and 19 when she had me, and then 20 when she became a feminist. So you might have reversed those, Mom. Saved you a lot of stress. But she has, my parents and my grandparents were my mentors and my role models, but she, more than anybody, has been my role model for many reasons. I remember when I was about 12, I was taking a confirmation class in church up in Ohio where I grew up, where she grew up. And we were learning about Christianity, and I just wasn't getting it. And I wasn't getting the concept, I guess. And so I asked my mom, what is a Christian? And she said, and I still remember asking this question, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, I can't tell you what a Christian is, but I can show you. And then she started talking about Dr. King. This would have been around 1970, so after he was killed. And, of course, what she meant was what she did with her life and has done is show people what it means to be a Christian, which to her means to work for peace and justice and nonviolence, and that's what she has done most of my life. She worked, demonstrated with farm workers and never let me eat green grapes and head lettuce for a long, long time, or stop at Exxon for a long, long time. And she marched with civil rights workers and against the war, and went back to college in her 30s and got a master's degree in her 40s, and became a speech pathologist and helped children with all kinds of disabilities most of her life, including her 4 children. So anyway, I want to thank her for being here. And I want to start talking to you about religion in Memphis, which is kind of a subject I've spent a little time with. I actually started in 1993. On January 30th, 1993, the Commercial Appeal had a little article in the paper. This was the day before Super Bowl 27. There was a little article that told readers that the Commercial Appeal had a new religion reporter. That was me. I had taken over for John Bifus, who decided he'd rather go to the movies. John's still going to the movies, and I know. I'm still writing about religion some. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I don't know if you remember much about 1993. One of the first stories I wrote in 1993, on February 4th, I had a story about the demise of the Singles Church. Do you remember the Singles Church? Anybody who attended the Singles Church way back then? I think it was called New Life. It was a Methodist church, New Life Church or New Life Methodist Church, and it was just for singles. And it had been in existence almost 4 years when they closed it. And, of course, they closed it because they ran out of singles. Everybody got married. Mission accomplished. It might be the first church ever that actually accomplished its mission in our lifetime. 1993 was also the year, if you remember this, of the launch of the World Wide Web, which was the beginning and end of journalism as I know it in all of our lives. It's also the year of the first World Trade Center bombing. And it was also the year of NAFTA. So that 1 year, so much changed. So much has changed since then. And I want to talk a little bit about how religion in Memphis has changed and how it really hasn't in those past 20-plus years. So I went back and I started looking at some of the stories that I wrote in that first year. And I wrote about 200 stories in that first year. There was a lot going on in Memphis and religion. And I want to talk about a few of those stories. One of the first stories and first series of stories I began to write in 1993 was about the exodus of churches east. A lot of churches were leaving Midtown, downtown, Fraser, Raleigh, Whitehaven, Parkway Village. I remember I wrote about one of the churches that was leaving Parkway Village and going to the new promised land of Hickory Hill. And I remember the pastor who had grown up in Parkway Village talking sort of wistfully about the 1960s in Parkway Village when he first started going to church there. And he said, you know, Parkway Village was the Cordova of the 60s. I remember when Cordova was the Lakeland of the 80s. So it's amazing how things have changed. But so many churches at that time in the early to mid-90s were moving out of Memphis and moving to the suburbs. And I think there were a lot of concerns about what that was going to do to the community, what that was going to do to the city especially, and to some neighborhoods. And it obviously has had a profound effect on many neighborhoods. And a lot of it's not good. But I also think that over the past 20-plus years, there have been a lot of changes, and I'll talk about those that are really positive, really hopeful, and I think there's been a shift. There have been churches and people moving back in to Memphis. And I just wrote a column a couple weeks ago about millennials. And one of the most encouraging things that I've seen in the past 5 or 7 years in Memphis has been the shift of young people, millennials, who grew up in the suburbs in Memphis or in other cities, grew up in places like Central Church and First of Van and Germantown Baptist and Bellevue and so Hope Pres and so forth, and have started coming back in to the city and bringing their faith with them and starting mostly non-denominational churches, and not in church buildings, but renting space in schools and cafes, Minglewood Hall, places like that. There's been places like the Neighborhood Church, Christ City Church, All Saints, which I think is an Episcopal church, the Living Church, which I just wrote about a couple weeks ago, which is going to open a new sort of a hostel for youth workers to come into Memphis and do mission work. And there have been at least a half a dozen of these, or maybe more, over the past 5 years that have opened in Memphis, and I think that's a really encouraging sign. They've created a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm around the city. I think that's one of the reasons you see places like Overton Square and Overton Park and Levitt Shell and Cooper Young and Crosstown and Broad Street and all these things sort of reviving all these efforts to save things like the Greensward and save things like the Coliseum. I think these millennials, my kids, your grandkids, have such a different outlook. They're not only the largest generation in America, but they're the most educated. And according to all the polls, they're the most optimistic, the most hopeful generation we've ever had. And that includes the boomers, the post-war boomers, which I think is really amazing considering that these are kids who grew up after 9/11. And yet they have this incredible hope and optimism and energy, and they're bringing it into Memphis through Teach for America, through the MTR program, Memphis Teacher Residency, Episcopal Service Corps, Church Health Center Fellows. There's all of these sort of mission service-oriented programs going on. Some are connected to congregations, some aren't. But these young people are on a mission. And they're on a mission to have fun, and they're on a mission to do some serious work. And they really care about the issues that affect urban life. And that is nothing but good for Memphis. As I wrote in my column a couple weeks ago, we have a lot of opportunities for these young people, and they are taking them on. So when I started writing about these Exodus 25 years ago, I was really worried about Memphis, but now, not so much. I'm really encouraged by what I've seen in the past 5 years from these millennials. So let me move on to the second one. In 1993, or it might have been early 94, after the first World Trade Center bombing, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of concern, a lot of sort of questioning about Islam and Muslims. Who are they? What is Islam all about? I think that was sort of the first wave that I noticed of sort of people really wanting to know more about this faith called Islam. And so I remember doing this story. I went to, we had 3 mosques at the time, 3. One was down on South 3rd. It was a mosque for African-American converts, people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Muhammad Ali, which I think is the kind of Muslims that most Americans were familiar with up to that point. There was a Nation of Islam mosque from, Malcolm X and that sort of strain of radical nationalistic Islam that came through in America in the 1950s and 60s, and that was the second mosque in Memphis, very small but very tight. And then the third mosque in Memphis at that time was at the U of M for Muslim students who were coming to Memphis State and other area colleges to do graduate work, postgraduate work, really bright kids. They grew up to be engineers and doctors and lawyers. And it was sort of the first wave of Muslim Arab immigration into the United States, which sort of began in the late 60s and really picked up in the 80s. So you had 3 mosques, and I remember interviewing Muslims at all 3 mosques and sort of trying to understand more about what Islam was all about and what it meant to them and how they practiced it. And it was really fascinating conversations that I had, and I really got intrigued by it. But it was very low-key. There wasn't really a lot of concern other than, there were a couple of the World Trade Center bombing and a couple of incidents, but mostly it was, even they felt like they were invisible. Like people didn't even know they were here. Very quiet. So I felt like I was almost performing a public service by just sort of introducing Memphis to our Muslim neighbors. Well, now, 15, 20, 25 years later, things have changed dramatically, obviously. We now have 9, and we're going on 10 mosques. I think the Muslim population in Memphis has grown to be about equal to and probably has surpassed the Jewish population in the Mid-South area for sure. There are so many other kinds of Muslims. Usually, in the beginning, mostly it was Arab and some Indian, Pakistani Muslims. But now, Africa, they're coming from everywhere. They're here. They love it. And I'm proud to say that I think Memphis has done a tremendous job welcoming Muslims. We have not had a single problem that I'm aware of. The kinds of problems they're having just up the road in Middle Tennessee and other parts of the South and other parts of the country. Muslims here feel really valued, really appreciated, really welcomed and accepted. They feel like neighbors. They feel like friends. And I think they've been really amazed by how open and accepting the people of Memphis have been to them and getting to know them. And, Holy Communion is one of the reasons that I think that's happened. I know you guys have been so incredibly open and welcoming and have opened your doors and tried to create dialogues and discussions and understanding and learning. And I think that's really been important. You've been laying groundwork, and in little ways it's been happening all over the community. So when things happen, when bad things happen, like Chattanooga or Santa Barbara, I think we understand because we know our fellow Muslims in this town. What happened at Heart Song Church, one of the things I wrote about when I came back, with the Methodist Church sort of opening its doors to the neighbors across the street, the new Muslim Islamic Center, putting up a sign, "Welcome to the neighborhood." That created international news. I mean, that made news all around the world. That church is still getting calls from Muslims, Muslim news services, and people around the world trying to find out how did that happen, why did that happen. And, Steve Stone, the minister, is just like, I don't know how to explain it to him. I'm taught to love your neighbor, and that's what I believe, and that's what we did. And, it's been great. So I think if there were concerns back in the early 90s when I started writing about religion, I don't think there were so many concerns as just sort of maybe just a little bit of anxiety because we don't really understand. I think those have been, obviously there's tensions. Obviously there are people in this community and people everywhere who are concerned and fearful and maybe even angry. But I'm really optimistic about the way things have gone in this community and the way this community has accepted and embraced the Muslim community. And they're really working together. One of the things that's happening with MIFA, I just talked to somebody at MIFA. MIFA is going to be celebrating its 50th. Is that right? Wow. In 2018. And they really want to sort of up their interfaith presence in the Memphis community. Now, there really hasn't been a whole lot of structured interfaith activity in the past 10 to 15 years. I'm not sure why that is. The Memphis Ministers Association was very strong when I started covering religion back in the early 90s. But it was mostly a Christian-Jewish organization, ministers and rabbis, mostly on the progressive side. There was the National Conference of Christians and Jews in Memphis when I started covering religion a long time ago. They eventually morphed into what became known as Diversity Memphis because they wanted to be more inclusive than just Christians and Jews. So they invited Muslims and Hindus and others into the fold. But when that happened, it just sort of lost steam, and that has really almost become defunct. So there's really no sort of organization, no sort of structure right now for any kind of interfaith activity. But there are things that are happening all the time. So maybe it's better that way. I don't know. Maybe it's better not to have some sort of big umbrella organization. But MIFA really feels it has a mission, because it's the Metropolitan Interfaith Association, to get more involved in interfaith work and to have that interfaith work happen on a service level and not just a dialogue discussion level, which I think would be great. So I think that's very encouraging too. See, Mom, you taught me to see the glass as half full, and somebody keeps pouring stuff into it. So one of the first stories I wrote in 1993 was about we were getting 2 new bishops in Memphis. Anybody remember who one of the bishops was? 1993. It was the second bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of West Tennessee, James Coleman. Since then, we've had only one other Episcopal bishop. Don Johnson is only the 3rd Episcopal bishop of the West Tennessee Diocese. Isn't that amazing? 3 bishops over all that time, and only 2 since 1993. That's an amazing testament, I think, to the stability of this diocese and the stability of this community. And then the other bishop, of course, was Terry Stibe, who had just been appointed the Catholic bishop of Memphis. He was the 5th Catholic bishop. He's still the 5th Catholic bishop, although he has announced his plans to retire, and that'll probably happen sometime this year officially. But he's been the Catholic bishop for over 20 years here in Memphis. So those 2 men, those 2 presences, those 2 offices in this community have created a very stable situation that I think is very positive. And, you know, the Episcopal Diocese bringing in all these great young priests. You guys have at least 3 of them. Is that right? 3? And they're just doing them at Dorothy and Chris and Richard, and all these young priests are coming in. I don't know why they all seem to be coming from Virginia, but we're glad to have them. So that is really, I think that shows one way that things have stayed the same, but also have begun to change. It's sort of the generational shift. Another story I wrote, I don't know if you remember this. Anybody ever went to the Shiloh Christian Club back in the early 90s? I wrote about this new Christian nightclub called Shiloh. It was opening up in the Sycamore View area, and it was an attempt by these crazy Methodists again to try to bring in young people into the church. And so they created this nightclub. They thought, well, you know, kids don't want to come to church anymore, and so let's create a space that is, you know, sort of Christian but also fun, and maybe they'll get to come in, we can talk to them and get to know them, develop relationships, and then maybe at some point, you know, if they get married and have kids, they really start thinking about God and that sort of thing. They'll want to come to church. It lasted about a year, but I think that it was sort of a precursor. My memory is that it was sort of a precursor to the development of the contemporary worship service, which sort of began around that time in various denominations, various churches across town. Another attempt back then to bring in young baby boomers who were then in their 30s. But we're still dealing with that, right? Every generation seems to go to church a little less, have fewer sort of affiliations with organized denominations, and we're still struggling with that. We're still trying to figure out what that means and if that matters, and how do we deal with that. Every church, every denomination, trust me, is dealing with that. Even the Southern Baptists and Bellevue Baptists, they're all shrinking in some ways. And it's because the Millennial Generation, and in some cases the Generation X, just don't go to church as much as we did, or as much as my parents did. So, we've tried all kinds of ways to get them in, right? We've tried guitars and drums and contemporary Christian music and cool young priests, and it's all great, it's all good. But I think when I look around and I see what is sort of working, or at least what sort of is bringing young people or keeping young people in the fold in some ways, or bringing them in, and that is service. And that's one of the things I talked about in that millennial column. Young people want to serve. They want to help. They don't see necessarily a connection between worship and service, whereas it was just sort of a natural connection for my generation, I think, and for my parents for sure. I don't think they see it that way. But I also think that that's why they're sort of starting their own attempts to create faith communities. And they're doing it. They're just doing it in a different way. So when I think you see all these polls, these Pew polls and other polls that show, the category other and the category unchurched is growing, and that's creating all kinds of concern, I don't really get concerned about that, because I think people, young people especially, are maybe redefining church, and maybe redefining church in good, positive ways. Not the church gathered so much, but the church scattered. Not sort of going to church, but being the church and going out into the world and being the hands and feet of Christ, or the hands and feet of whatever faith you happen to believe in. And I see that everywhere. I see that all over town. And so I think that you shouldn't be too concerned. Obviously, you got to pay the light bill, and you got to, keep the building up, and there's wonderful things happening inside this building and on this property. Important things that really matter. And this is, Verna Dozier, the great Episcopal laywoman, wrote, the church gathered is important. The church, this is where you come to remember the story. This is where you come to be healed and to find new motivation and new light and so forth and so on. So it's important. But they're doing that. They're creating their own gatherings. But they're just doing it in a different way. So I'm encouraged by that too. Another story I wrote, anybody remember Life Focus? Something called Life Focus, 93. Believe it or not, in 1993, some white evangelicals and some black evangelicals got together and decided to have a Christian crusade. This was actually the first interracial Christian crusade in Memphis, 1993. Very big deal, because not only were the sort of progressive Christians involved in this, but the evangelicals were involved in this in a big way, especially Bellevue and Central Church. And it was pretty impressive. Now, it got into some weeds when they started talking about, is this all about evangelism, or is this all about the community? Is this about bringing people together, or is this about sort of bringing people into the church? And sort of it lost a little steam, but it did lead to some really good things. They did have a couple of crusades, and that sort of morphed or moved into the Love Thy Neighbor movement. Do you remember Love Thy Neighbor? In the mid-'90s, late 90s, mostly Christ Methodist Church and Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church decided to keep their part of this going by getting together on a regular basis, and especially on Easter Sunday when they'd have the big Easter Sunday service down at the Pyramid. I think they had 4 or 5 of those, and it was a really impressive thing. They had the big love chain down Poplar Avenue. And I think it made a statement. I think it was an important statement to make. I think it also, in the course of making that statement, shifted the emphasis from, honestly, one of the bigger stories I covered in my first couple of years as a religion reporter in the early 90s was what they called the pulpit swap. When a black preacher would go to a white church and preach, or the white preacher would go to the black church, or the white preacher would take his congregation to the black church, and so forth. And that was still big. That was news back then. It's not news anymore. That's a good thing. Not only is it not news, but last year I wrote about, for Zola Law, a black woman who was elected to be the pastor of Lindenwood Christian Church. First time in Memphis, an African-American woman had been hired to lead a predominantly white congregation. So things are changing like that. It's no longer just a one Sunday pulpit swap. It's a full-time pulpit swap. So things are changing in that way too. But Life Focus led to Love Thy Neighbor, which in some ways led to Fellowship Memphis. Y'all familiar with Fellowship Memphis, which is an intentionally interracial congregation. It's in several locations in Memphis. They're doing great work. Fellowship Memphis led to Choose 901. Y'all know about Choose 901, the Millennial effort, which is sort of a faith-based effort to bring young people to Memphis and to bring them into Memphis to serve and to participate in our civic life. So you see these little things ripple out. And you may look back and think, well, Life Focus was kind of a dud. It was around for a little while and it didn't really have much of an impact. Well, it really did. It really did. So I think when you're seeing little things like that happen now, when you sort of scope out and think, what's going to happen, what kind of impact is it going to have 20, 30 years from now? It could have a huge impact. The discussions you have here around Islam, they may seem small, but they're going to have an impact. They are going to have an impact that continues to ripple out for generations. They really are. And as an old-time religion journalist, I have all this perspective now, so I can tell you, it's going to happen. Trust me. 20 years from now, you're going to have the Religion Reporter Commercial Appeal come up here and tell you, you remember when you had that 2016 panel? On the other hand, maybe you won't have a religion reporter coming 20 years from now. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, the most exciting thing I did in my first full year as a religion reporter was to cover two really big events in Memphis. One was when President Clinton, newly elected President Clinton, came to Mason Temple and spoke to the Church of God in Christ Holy Convocation. First time a president had ever set foot in Mason Temple, first time a president had ever addressed the Kojic Convocation right here in Memphis. Our neighbor next door, Bill Clinton, and he gave the speech of his presidency. Everybody still thinks his Memphis speech was his best speech. And it was a speech about the crisis of the Spirit. Now, he was also in Memphis for two other things. He went to Orange Mound or somewhere over there to a church and talked about his crime bill. If you remember his crime bill, Bill Clinton's crime bill, was sort of his effort, his administration's effort with Congress to increase the number of police officers in our streets, increase the number of prisons and jails space. And that started ramping up all of our criminal justice efforts, and now we're dealing with issues like mass incarceration as a result of some of that. Another thing that he talked about a lot, he went to, I can't remember where he went to, but he talked somewhere around town about NAFTA. As we all know, the impact, good and bad, NAFTA has had on our economy, on globalization. You can't undo that. That's the way it is now. But that was all happening back then. And then, of course, he talked about something, I don't know if we have any memory of this, but there was something way back when called healthcare reform. So, the more things change. And then a couple months later, Al Gore came to town, Vice President Gore came to town and spoke downtown, and he talked about race, which is another thing we've sort of been dealing with for a while. I want to read a couple of things that I wrote back then, real short, about Clinton's visit and then about Gore's. Okay, so here's what President Clinton said at Mason Temple. There are changes we in government can make from the outside in. Then there's some changes we're going to have to make from the inside out, or others won't matter. Sometimes there are no answers from the outside in. Sometimes all the answers have to come from the values and the stirrings and the voices that speak to us from within. And he he was standing in Mason Temple in the pulpit where Dr. King preached the mountaintop sermon. And he said, Dr. King would say, I did not live and die to see the American family destroyed. I fought for freedom, he would say, but not for the freedom of people to kill each other with reckless abandon. Not for the freedom of children to have children and the fathers of the children to walk away from them and abandon them as if they don't amount to anything. I fought for people to have the right to work, but not to have whole communities and people abandoned. Now that made a huge impact, obviously, back then. Standing ovation for several minutes from the Kojic crowd. But it just goes to show, almost 25 years later, we're still dealing with the same issues, not only in this community, but across the country. And then when Vice President Gore came, he spoke at the NAACP's annual Freedom Fund banquet, actually, at the Peabody. And he said, this is 1993, the issue of race in America will not yield easily to resolution, but unless it is brought into the open and confronted, it threatens to consume our society. Just went to see a play last night at Calvary about Frederick Douglass. It's called The Making of an American Prophet. It's a really excellent play. And one of the quotes that Douglass, the character, guy who plays Douglass, says is that Americans have always found it easier to be generous than to be just. And, you think about that. That is just the most profoundly disturbing, oddly encouraging. I don't know how to take that. And I think that's still true. I think that may be true for all people. It's easier to write a check than to, go down there and do some work. It's easier to change. In some ways, it's easier to change an individual's life than a system, right? So it's easier to deal with relationships and racism and prejudice on a personal level than it is to deal with it systemically. And so, I think that maybe the most encouraging thing for me about what I've seen in Memphis and in religion over the past 25 years here is that people are out there every day. You are out there every day. We're all out there every day, not just trying to make a difference personally with relationships, which is obviously, I think, as important, more important than anything. But there are a lot of people out there who are trying to make systemic changes in the way things work and the way things don't work. They're trying to address justice issues in Memphis, disparity issues in Memphis, inequality issues in Memphis, every day. Young people, old people, church people, non-church people. I see it all the time. I wish I could write, my wife would kill me, but I wish I could write every day about all of this work that's being done, because it really is encouraging. There are so many problems we have, but can you imagine what this place would be like if those people weren't out there? If all of us weren't doing whatever little piece we could do to try to not just make it work, but make it better. And we're motivated. Why are we doing it? Well, we're not just doing it to be nice. We're not just doing it to be good. Sure, there's some economic reasons to do it. I went to a meeting yesterday about sentencing reform in Tennessee, and one of the issues they're pushing is what they call the second death penalty. You may or may not know this, but Tennessee is the only state. There are sort of three first-degree murder sentences you can get in just about anywhere. One is death. We have that. One is life without parole. We have that. Most states have that. And then we have one called life with parole. But in Tennessee, life with parole begins at 51 years. You automatically get 51 years before they will consider you for parole. Juries are not allowed to know that. The judge cannot tell them that. But that's the way it is. So if you are a juror and you decide this person maybe deserves some mitigating factor, yes, he killed somebody, but there was abuse involved, or whatever. There's mitigation. So you want this person to have some chance of parole sometime in his or her life down the road. You're thinking, well, maybe they'll be 20, 30 years, and then they can, they'll be older and wiser. No, 51 years. So even if you're 20, 51 years, it's a life sentence. It's a death sentence, really. So they're trying to change that, but the way they're having to go about it generally speaking with legislators, is to talk about the economic issues, because not only does it cost about $25,000 a year to incarcerate somebody in Tennessee, but once they pass the age of 50, that doubles because of their health issues, geriatric issues. You age a lot faster in prison, so you have a lot more problems. So by the time a prisoner reaches age 50, you're paying about $50,000 a year to incarcerate them. There are also studies, all kinds of studies, federal studies, private studies, that show that the recidivism rate for people convicted of murder after they've reached a certain age is almost zero. And by recidivism, I don't mean they're committing another murder. I mean they're just, violating their probation, or they're getting a misdemeanor or some kind of very small felony, like 1%. So basically, they're trying to make the case, not only are you paying all this money to incarcerate people for the rest of their lives, but you're paying people who are the least likely to commit a crime. And it just doesn't make economic sense. So that's how they're approaching it. They're not approaching it as a justice issue, although the woman who's pushing this actually went to seminary. She lives in Nashville. She's a lawyer, but she also went to seminary. And she said, you would think that in a state where we tried to make the Bible the official book of the state, that justice might have, and redemption might have a little bit, you might be thinking about that a little bit when you're talking about the law. So anyway, there are all kinds of economic issues why all of this work we're doing is good and important work. But that's not why we're doing it, I don't think. I think we're doing it because we're motivated by something larger. I know that's why my wife goes and works in inner city schools every day. What gets her going is because she's motivated by her faith. And that's what I see out there all the time. Whatever your faith, whatever your practice, whatever your affiliation, that's what motivates most of the people I see from inside themselves. They feel compelled. And this is one thing I've learned from my mother, is you are compelled because of your beliefs. Your beliefs compel you. You're not required. I'm a Methodist, so I'm all about grace alone. So you're not required to do the work. You're compelled to do the work. And I see that everywhere I go. So I think a lot of bad things happening out there. You watch TV, local TV news. Seems like a war zone out there sometimes. And there are places where it's tough. It's really, really tough. But overall, I think we're in the best place you can be if you're a person of faith and you take your faith seriously. This community takes faith seriously, and this community puts its faith to work every day. And I saw that when I started covering religion in '93, and I still see it today. Now, the one final change I'll talk about, and I'm not happy to talk about this, but this is the way it is. For the past year and a half, we have not had a religion section in the Commercial Appeal. We used to have something called Faith in Memphis. For the past year and a half or so, we haven't had a religion reporter at the Commercial Appeal for the first time, maybe ever. I took over for Bifus. Bifus took over for Tom Bailey. Tom Bailey took over for Penny Crabtree. Penny Crabtree took over. We've had a long line of really excellent religion reporters going back to the 50s and the 40s, I think. And we don't have that anymore. And when I started covering religion in the early 90s, we probably had almost 200 journalists on staff. Now we're down to about 70. And those are the economics of print journalism right now. Hopefully we're going to be able to figure this digital thing out and make it work as a business model. But until then, we're going to be tight. We're going to be shrinking. And one of the casualties has been religion. Personally, I think that's tragic, especially in this community. I don't think there's a more important beat. I hope I'm not struck down by saying this. I don't even think the Grizzlies are more important than religion. Although we don't seem to have any trouble finding people to cover the Grizzlies. I love the Grizzlies. I'm really happy they're here, but I don't think they're quite as important. But that's just the way it is. So that's where we are. I don't know how that's going to change. I don't know whether that's going to change when we have the new owners come in this year. But I'm hoping that maybe they'll bring some more resources and we can at least go back to covering religion on a part-time basis in Memphis. That'd be nice. In the meantime, we have social media. We have Kara. Kara's out there every day pushing stuff, reporting stuff. Lots of churches are hiring people like Kara to do that sort of thing, and I think that's a really encouraging, positive thing too. There's actually more information out there than ever before. So it's not hard to find stuff. But I do think we missed that. I think what the newspaper provided for a long time, maybe not always well, but I think it has always provided that sort of common, that public square space where we can all see the community together, where we can all see we are part of a larger community. And I don't really think there's any other place like that. I think social media can do that sometimes, but doesn't do it very often, and tends to be just the reverse. It tends to sort of put everybody in their little friend space. And so I think it further balkanizes the community in some ways. So I think we still need that. And I think we still have to find ways to do that. I don't know what that might look like if newspapers go away. But hopefully we'll figure that out too. Some millennials, some little Bill Gates will figure this out, and we'll all be better off for it. So that's all I want to say. Does anybody want to have any questions about the Grizzlies or the Super Bowl? Yeah. Yeah, Zola Law, who grew up in Texas. She's an African-American woman. Grew up in Texas. She came to Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church maybe 10, 12 years ago to be on the staff there. Lindenwood Christian Church, as you all know, has been around a long time. It's a Disciples of Christ congregation. I think it's the second largest in Memphis, one of the largest and most influential in that denomination, and has been for a long time. It's predominantly white, but not all white. They've had some struggles in the past 10 years, some personnel issues, some financial issues, like a lot of churches, like every church at some point. But they took a magnificent, I still can't believe they did it, actually. Honestly, I can't believe they hired an African-American woman to be their pastor. And this is just not some African-American woman who, sort of a milquetoast kind of person. For Zola is all that and a bag of chips. I mean, she is in your face. She is bold. She will agitate. She's amazing. And they hired her. And they love her. I'm sure everybody doesn't, but they do. Most people who are there do. And they're doing much better financially and otherwise. They've still got some struggles like all churches, especially like all Midtown churches are still struggling in some ways. But I think they're doing really well. And I think it was a real testament not only to that congregation's what I think of as holy boldness, but I think it was a real testament to what's happening in Memphis. Because eventually that's not going to be a story either. 20 years from now, it's not going to be a big deal whenever any church hires any pastor of any race. It's just not going to cause a blip. But it has to start with things like that. And I still remember writing the first time a black woman became the pastor of a black Baptist church. And that was probably in the early 90s too. And that was a huge deal. So, we keep, you may be familiar with some of the issues around, church issues around homosexuality and gay marriage. And I don't know if that's come up here, but, or in your denomination, but, big steps lead to little steps lead to big steps. But it seems to all be marching in a good direction, yeah. They're all feeling it. Church of God in Christ is feeling it. National Baptist Church, Progressive National Baptist Church, AME, CME. Honestly, every mainline and every traditional denominational church is feeling this generational shift and trying to deal with this generational shift, not just in terms of the people, but in terms of technology and everything else, changing mores and changing traditions. And in many ways, the black church is much more conservative on many social issues, moral issues, so-called moral issues, than the white church. So they've had an especially difficult time with things like gay marriage. And they're fighting tooth and nail, and they're losing young people because of it. That's one of the reasons they're losing young people. But I think they're also losing young people because my kids, I'm not going to say they don't see color. Of course they see color. I don't know how you cannot see color ever. But it's just not a factor for them, or at least not as much of a factor as it was for us. So I think that's true among young African-American people, too. They just don't see the color. So when you try to create a situation where it's historically, culturally, socially, all black, all white, for whatever reason, it just doesn't work as well anymore. It just doesn't make as much sense anymore. So that's another issue they're dealing with. And that's trickling down into finances and everything else. So I think it's an institutional issue. Not a black, not a white, not an evangelical, not a mainline. It's affecting some more than others, but everybody is dealing with it, and it's a struggle. Yeah. John Carroll. Yeah, that's the guy I mentioned earlier. John Carroll is a product of Fellowship Memphis, and he moved here. I can't remember how long, maybe 15 years ago, to be part of Fellowship Memphis, and over the course of several years, he has sort of now become the head of Choose 901. He developed Choose 901, and he did it for faith-based reasons. He's a very strong Christian, and he wants to provide ways for Millennial Generation people not only to come to Memphis for missions and service, but to stay in Memphis. He wants to keep them, and he wants to keep the kids who grew up here, keep them here or bring them back from college. And he thinks the way to do that is to provide connection, to provide relationship, community, in a way that maybe the church used to, but doesn't anymore or isn't doing that anymore. And he's also trying to be aware of this move back into the city. And he really feels like that's important. He says most millennials surveys show that most millennials want to live within 3 to 5 miles of a downtown. They want to live in older parts of town because that's real to them. They grew up in the suburbs. So they're moving, just like all of us did. We all move away from home on some level. They want to move away from that home life they knew, the suburban model, and move back into the real, authentic city. And so that's why they love places like Levitt Shell and love places like the old Crosstown Sears building. And they want to transform that into something new and different and wonderful. They don't want to tear it down. They don't want to put up a mall. They want to take the space and transform it into something useful. And that's the kind of thing John Carroll's doing. That's happening at McLean Baptist Church, which is on the corner of McLean and Jackson, right on the corner from where we live. McLean Baptist Church is, I think, might be the last Southern Baptist church. It's certainly the last Southern Baptist church inside the parkways. It might be the last Southern Baptist church inside the 240 loop. I'm not sure. But anyway, they've struggled for a long time, declining numbers, older congregation. They were ready to move. They were ready to sell. They've had offers from you-know-who drugstore. But they've held out, and they've held on, and they didn't want to do that because that is probably, well, it's maybe the most beautiful church spire in Memphis, but it's a beautiful place, beautiful location. McLean Baptist Church was actually one of the first churches to be part of VECA, and VECA was one of the first sort of interracial neighborhoods in Memphis, and they were a big part of that way back when. So they've got this great history there in that neighborhood, and they don't want it to lose that. So they've opened their church to this young congregation that moved in about 5 years ago called Living Hope, one of these non-denominational millennial congregations that needed a place to worship, needed a place to sort of set up shop. And so they opened their church to them. They let them share space. And now John Carroll and Choose 901 are going to set up a place for Serve 901 that is also working in conjunction with St. George's. St. George's is doing great stuff in Memphis, and this is one of those things. And so John's idea is not only are you going to be able to bring young people in on spring break mission trips and summer mission trips and fall break mission trips from colleges around the country and introduce them into Memphis and hook them into Memphis and especially Midtown, but you're going to be able to bring suburban kids in from St. George's and Collierville and Germantown and so forth and give them some exposure to the city. He said he's met kids who grew up in Memphis, who went to school in Germantown, Collierville, wherever. They're 18, 19, 20 years old, and they've never been to Midtown. Or they've never been to Midtown without their parents. Just, I don't understand that. But so, it's all I mean, it's really, I think it's a really hopeful thing. But it's all service-based. So I think they're finding ways to take old space, take old wineskins, if you will, and put some new wine on them. Yeah. You're always bucking the trend, aren't you? That's right. Well, I mean, I think it's all about service. I really do. And I don't think that's necessarily just a millennial thing. I think that's a human thing, and I think to me, that's a faith thing. Relationships and service. Meaningful work, meaningful relationships. If you have a church community that provides that offers meaningful work and meaningful relationships, then I think you have something. And I think it's something that will attract people and draw people to you because they want to find out what is going on there. Why are they doing these things? And it may be that you're doing service projects out in the community. It may be that you're bringing service projects into this space. You're developing relationships on various levels. I know you have a Downton Abbey thing. My mother loves Downton Abbey. Just little things like that too. I mean, they're really important. And so one thing that I've always loved about Holy Communion is that you have always had this willingness, not just to buck the trend, but to sort of experiment and try things and open yourselves up and not just be a members-only club. And I think that's when churches begin to decline. The moment a congregation becomes a members-only club, whether it's 50 people or 500 people, that's when you start shutting people out, intentionally or not. You just get a vibe. And I think what people are looking for, young people especially, are community. They're looking for community. And there are so many young people coming into Memphis through Teach for America and other programs like that, and they're coming in alone, basically. So one of the things John Carroll's trying to do is create community. He's trying to create a place where these young people could come and get to know other people like themselves and other people in Memphis. One of the things they do, I think I mentioned this, is that they have Memphians host Thanksgiving dinners for these young people who are from out of town. They're going to go back home for Christmas, but they're not going to go back home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. So they're here for Thanksgiving, and they don't have any family. So they're trying to create places where these young people can go for Thanksgiving dinner with a family. And that is to help people begin to develop relationships and to feel welcome and to feel connected. And I think that is what you have always been about, at least from what I've seen. You have always tried to find ways to connect with the greater community, to serve the greater community, and then to welcome people in for all kinds of things, and not just to sit in the pew on Sunday. Yeah.
Have you ever done did you ever do any study or any work with Code North?
Oh, I remember Code North, yeah. I think, I can't remember the name of the sisters. Was it Sister Nolita?
Sister
Elizabeth. Yeah, that was a ministry in North Memphis. I think it was one of the nuns, one of the orders, anyway, created this housing ministry in North Memphis. Yeah, I remember that. They did some wonderful work. There's some great work going on in North Memphis right now, especially in just the north side of downtown, with all the stuff that's going on with Habitat. Jimmy Carter's coming back in August to do his work project in Habitat communities. Habitat's repairing lots of homes in that community. Uptown is really starting to boom. It's just amazing what's happening around here. Yeah.
The other day on the news, the new police chief Romney was talking about partnering with a lot of the local churches. I don't know if it had to do with bringing in 400 new officers, or did you hear that, or what that was all about?
Yeah, well, I think he's a disciple of the community policing effort, and I think community policing is what Tony Armstrong tried to do. Although he got caught up in budget cuts and other things that kind of undermine some of that. But community policing is the idea that police should not just drive around in cars all day. They should get out and walk. They should get out and stop and talk to people. They should get out and meet people and get to know people in their precinct, in their patrol area, develop relationships. I rode with some cops last year who were doing that, and they'd stop. It was amazing how many times they'd stop and talk to kids, like in North Memphis, South Memphis, Hickory Hill. They would know so many people, and people would know them. And so they say, one of the things you've got to do is have people not see you. The only time they see you is when something bad's happening or something threatening is happening. They need to see you as human beings too. And we need to see them as human beings. The police need to see them as human beings too. And so I think that's one of the efforts they're trying to do. And so one of the best ways to do that, especially in a lot of neighborhoods, is go through church, to get to know the pastor and then get to know some of the folks in that church, to have the pastor invite the police to come for worship or to come for Sunday school or whatever on Wednesday night. So I think that's another really encouraging sign now. It's the toughest job. It's the toughest job in Memphis. It's the most complicated job. I don't think it's intractable, but I think it's going to take a lot more resources than we put into it, and not just policing, but safety. And that goes to all kinds of layers. So we'll see what Mayor Strickland can do. I think he's shown some positive signs that he's willing to take it, to sort of take the reins and really try to attack it. And I think that's one of the reasons. But I think he's going to go out and hire somebody else actually to lead the department. Yeah. I can't. After I wrote that first column on vouchers, I knew the whole time I was writing it I wasn't clear here. And one of the people who told me a long time ago about writing said, good writing is clear thinking made visible. And I'm still not thinking totally clearly on vouchers because it's a really complicated thing. I know so many people who are in favor of vouchers, who are good people with good hearts, who have good intentions, who really want to help as many people, as many kids as they can, as many families as they can, and they see the best and quickest way to do that is to give them a voucher and put them in a private school. And like I said in this morning's column, I hope that works. And I hope that program is as advertised. I just have a lot of concerns about it. I have a lot of concerns of primarily what it's going to do to the kids who aren't going to get the vouchers, who can't get the vouchers, who can't get into private schools for whatever reason because there isn't space, because they can't make the admissions, because they can't get the transportation, because whatever the reasons, or they get there and they can't stay. When Milwaukee did the voucher program, there was about a 75% turnover in the voucher program up there over time. So 75% of the kids who started in the voucher program at a young age did not graduate with the voucher program. And there's just, so I don't think it's I think it can help some kids, but I don't think it'll help enough kids, and I think it could end up hurting more kids than it helps because the kids who are left behind are going to have less support, less resources. I'll just give you a quick example. My wife has taught first grade for a long time, so she has a class of 20 kids in her first grade in Fraser. She's probably going to have 3 or 4 kids in that class who are really sharp, really on grade level or maybe above grade level. They're very verbal. They're very literate. They can read. They can communicate really well. They're well behaved. I mean, they've got really good parental support at home, even though they're living in a very tough neighborhood. And those kids not only do well for her and for that classroom and for that school, but they do well for those other kids in that classroom. Because when my wife is trying to help children model reading, model how to read a book or model how to read a passage or try to deal with comprehension and tell a story, she can do it, and that works sometimes. But it works even better sometimes when another child does it. And so when a child who's a slow reader or a non-reader sees another classmate not just reading a book, but getting excited about reading a book, or being able to manage his or her behavior in the classroom independently, not having the teacher tell her what to do, then that kind of modeling is invaluable in those classrooms. And so the kids my fear is the kids who are going to get the vouchers are going to be the brighter kids who can get in the admissions, the kids who have parental support, who can not only take advantage of this program, take the initiative to get into the program, but take the initiative to take that kid to wherever that private school is, deal with uniform or clothing issues, deal with extracurricular costs, deal with all those things that occur in private schools. And so you're going to lose those 2, 3, 4 really top kid-parent combos in so many of those classrooms. And then what do you have? You have kids who are even farther behind, who need more help, more resources than they're going to get. So, and I also have a serious problem with some of the people some of the big foundations and money that's going into this push for vouchers. I really think their intentions are to create 2-class education systems. One for private, elite, high cognitive kids of whatever race, and another one for public. Did you know that our public school system, last year for the first time, maybe since the Depression, the majority of kids in our public schools are poor, are living in poverty. Majority of kids in our public schools. I mean, that just doesn't create a financial, economic, tax issue. That creates a academic, pedagogical problem, because that just makes it even more dysfunctional, even more difficult for those teachers and those administrators to teach those kids and raise those kids up. And in Memphis, it's not 50%, it's like 85% poor kids in the system. So I just have a lot of conflicting issues. I think there are good intentions, and I think there are people who really want to make it work and really want to help some kids and will do that. But I also think that in the long run, the larger picture, it just won't really solve the problem, and I think it's going to make it worse. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us, David. This has been such a rich conversation. And I think this models exactly the rich blessing that we have of this community to gather and have such conversations about our civic and shared life outside the walls of our church. So I do encourage you to continue those conversations through the rest of our classes and opportunities as we gather here as a church community. Thank you again, David, and we will hope to see you in church. And everyone, church starts in about 6 minutes.